Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the MEAM departmental seminar. And we have a couple of you here, and I see most of you, probably more than 30 people, are actually watching this talk online. So thanks also to those people who are watching this talk through Zoom. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Catherine Gall from Stanford University. She's an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. She got her bachelor's and master's degree in aerospace engineering from the Delft University of Technology in Netherlands, and also her PhD from the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics in Belgium. And after that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Turbulence Research at Stanford, and that is a time I had a short overlap with her. When I was starting my PhD. After that, she also was a research professor at the VKI. She started her faculty career actually at Columbia University, a nearby place from here. And she moved to Stanford. And from there, she's been working as an assistant professor in the civil and environmental engineering. So today, she's going to share her research on using numerical simulations for high-rise building to improve our understanding on what is the environmental effect of the wind on this building and how we can improve the design of this building using numerical simulation. So without further ado, I will introduce Professor Catherine Gall here, and let's welcome her. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to give this talk today. So I'll start by acknowledging collaborators from the Politecnico di Milano, because they really provided the measurement data that we've been using here, and also from the Florida International University Wall of Wind, because we repeated the experiment in that facility to make sure we had double data. And then we have funding from NSF and the Exceed computational resources. And then I also always like to start by introducing the people that actually did the work. So my current lab members are on the left, and Mattia Carlatani is the person currently working on this topic. And then the former lab members, Giacomo Lamberti contributed a lot to this work, and Zhu Huang, who was a postdoc in my lab as well. So this is the overview of the talk for today. I'll start by introducing very generally how I think about predictive computational wind engineering. So what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what is our overall long-term goal? And then I focus more specifically on the topic of today's talk, so cladding load predictions. And I'll talk about the specific objectives and the test case that I'll discuss. And then we'll go to look at some results. So I'll present large eddy simulations for high-rise cladding loads at a 0-degree wind direction, so where the wind is perpendicular to one of the building facades. We'll look at how inflow conditions are very important, and then validate the results and look at the sensitivity analysis. And then I'll move on to other wind directions, because the most negative peak pressure events actually occur at wind directions that are not perpendicular to one of the building facades. If I have time, I'll briefly cover some ideas and ongoing work on multi-fidelity simulation strategies, and then I'll end with a summary and an outlook. Okay, so let's start by the overall introduction. So computational wind engineering for sustainable buildings and cities, and sustainable is really defined very broadly here. It means that we want the cities to be comfortable, healthy, energy efficient, safe, and resilient. There are actually quite a lot of flow challenges that play a role in making cities sustainable. A very common one that is looked at in wind engineering is pedestrian wind comfort and even pedestrian wind danger, because when you put up a new high-rise building in a city, you can locally get speed up of the wind flow around the building at pedestrian level. And that can cause uncomfortable conditions, but also very dangerous conditions. So it's actually, people have actually died from unsafe wind conditions and being blown over by wind. And a lot of municipalities have criteria for that you have to satisfy during the design before you get a building permit. Traditionally, these things are studied in the wind tunnel, but computational methods could do that as well. The second one is pollutant dispersion. So thinking about how do pollutants that are released within the urban canopy disperse through a city? What does that mean for air quality and for health? We have natural ventilation, which looks at using the natural resources of wind and buoyancy to drive flow through a building. It's important both to reduce energy consumption for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and then for health. And we've known that for a long time, but I think the recent pandemic has really made that very clear to the general public as well. We have urban wind resources, so you can think about where you could put up little wind turbines on building roofs, for example. And then urban heat island mitigation as well. So how can you incorporate green spaces or blue spaces, so parks or water features in cities, to try and reduce the temperature in the city? And then the topic of today's talk is wind loading, and that really looks at how can we make our buildings more resilient to extreme wind events. And it's actually a very important topic. In 2020, the insured loss due to extreme wind events was $57 billion. And most of the damage started by one of the cladding panels on a building facade or by cladding failure on a building facade. And once that happens, you get rain intrusion, which always comes with a high monetary loss afterwards. And you can get further failure because once one of the cladding panels fails, you get internal pressures as well in the building, and the whole, like if one roof tile disappears, the whole roof is likely to be broken. And it's a very interesting problem from fluid mechanics perspective as well. And that's what you see on the right in that graph on the bottom. So it shows you a pressure coefficient, which is the non-dimensional pressure on a point on the building facade as a function of time. And you see that you get these very negative suction peaks. So those are the ones that will really pull off these panels from the building facade. And it's tricky to measure these in the wind tunnel to really understand if you measure the pressure at one point, that is like a minus 10 CP. What does that mean for the load on an overall panel? And these are, of course, also challenging to predict in CU. So all of these problems have two challenges in common when we're trying to do the predictions. The first one is that you have a lot of variability in meteorological conditions. The flow in this city is driven by what happens at the larger scale in terms of the weather, right? And that is inherently variable. So if you're trying to predict this, you need to have an understanding of what changes in weather will mean for the quantities of interest that you're trying to predict. The second is that we're dealing with very complex flow physics, right? This is a very high Reynolds number turbulent flow with very complex geometries. And then often you also get multi-phase effects. In pollutant dispersion, you're looking at pollutant transport. There might be chemical reactions, urban heat island mitigation. You would have to think about evaporation, condensation, etc. There are also a lot of opportunities to try to predict these flows better. As we get more and more computing power available, we're able to run more accurate simulations, and we're also able to run more simulations, which means that we can start leveraging tools from uncertainty quantification. And we can also start to think about data assimilation because we see more and more sensors being put up in urban areas that actually give us data in terms of local wind speeds, local temperatures, etc. So all of these actually mean that we can really start thinking about using computational fluid dynamics to do predictions of these quantities of interest. And that is really our long-term goal in the lab. It's to establish efficient predictive modeling frameworks that can quantitatively support the sustainable building, design, and urban planning process. And to achieve that goal, we're going to use tools from uncertainty quantification and data assimilation, and focus a lot on validation with field measurements, because the field measurements really represent the full complexity and variability of the problem that you would see in real life. If you take something out and you put it in the wind tunnel, you're removing a lot of that variability and complexity. So schematically, the framework that we usually work on looks something like this. We have these two types of uncertainty. Uncertainty because we have variability in the inflow conditions to the simulations. And uncertainty because in most simulations, we have to use some sort of reduced order modeling. Then we do propagation of these uncertainties by running a larger number of deterministic simulations, and you combine that information to get predictions of probability distributions for your quantities of interest. And then we can validate that against field measurements. And when you think about these two types of uncertainties, the inflow conditions is kind of a multi-scale problem, right? So there we're going to rely either on field measurements or on simulations of the larger scale weather forecasting simulations to understand what that variability in the inflow conditions is. The other hand, uncertainty due to the reduced order model outputs is more of a multi-fidelity problem. So there you'll have to look at high fidelity simulations or experiments to understand better what that uncertainty is and how you could characterize it. And then lastly, we have the data simulations. So if you do have field measurements, you can compare that to your quantities of interest and then couple back and really get a better understanding of what these uncertainties are in the field you do measure. So whenever we develop frameworks like this, we start from an application because what the quantity of interest is really going to determine what the most important uncertainties are and how you're going to set up these frameworks. And we've kind of completed this whole loop on the topic of pollutant dispersion and the prediction of pedestrian wind. And for natural ventilation, we've done all of the components as well. But when we started looking at wind loading, we realized that this is too far ahead. First of all, we don't have field measurements available of wind pressures on high-rise buildings. And second of all, we kind of start from the point that we have some model that we trust at giving a reasonable prediction. And currently, CFD is not accepted as a design tool for calculating wind loads on buildings. So our starting point was really these two observations. We don't have full-scale measurements on high-rise buildings, and CFD is currently not accepted as a design tool. So we took a step back and we looked, okay, what happens in these wind tunnel experiments? Because that is really the way that engineering practice is going to calculate these wind loads. And they will record pressure time series simultaneously in several points, and that's up to 500 points usually on the surface of a building. So on the reduced scale model. And this is considered state of the art, but even though they have 500 points, there are more than 500 cladding panels on the building, right? So they are limited in spatial resolution. And then second, there is some uncertainty in the incoming wind in these wind tunnels as well. They try to reproduce what is considered a full-scale wind field, but there are some, it's a little bit of an art, right? There are challenges in that as well. So CFD really has something to offer here, right? If I put enough resolution in my simulation, I can actually calculate area average loads on the panels of the building directly. Now, the downside is that turbulence modeling is really key in this problem. If you remember that signal of CP that I showed you in the beginning with these very negative pressure peaks, that is really due to turbulence in the flow. So if we want to predict these negative suction peaks that will determine the peak loads, we really need to think about it. And we have two options there. One is to go to Reynolds average Navier-Stokes simulations, which model all of the turbulence and solve only for the mean flow. And that's going to be fast, but relatively inaccurate, or in this case, even very inaccurate for these turbulent quantities. The other option is to go to large eddy simulations where you resolve the larger scale turbulence in the flow and you will start to see these negative pressure peaks, right? And that's going to be more expensive, but more accurate. And given the overall distrust still in the community with respect to CFD, we decided to go for the second approach, right? We're first going to show that if you take a good model, you can actually predict these pressure peaks as you do in the winter. So this has been our starting point here. So I've reduced the framework, and because we go to high fidelity simulations, we're not gonna think right now about uncertainty in the reduced order model outputs, but we are still going to think about uncertainty because there is variability in the inflow conditions. And then we're gonna validate with a wind tunnel measurement. So we have wind tunnel measurement data available. We are going to look at what the uncertainty, the boundary layer in the wind tunnel was, and then propagate that through the LES. So to do this, we selected this test case. It's a rectangular planned building. It was put in the atmospheric boundary layer at the Politecnico di Milano and in the wall of wind. The building was 2 meters high, 1 meter long, and 0.3 meters wide. And the reason we picked this data set is because it's quite unique in terms of how they characterize the atmospheric boundary layer, which they generate with the spires and the roughness elements in the wind tunnel that you see in the picture on the left-hand side. And it was also unique in terms of the resolution of the pressure measurements, because instead of putting 500 pressure taps over the entire building, they focused on locations that they knew were critical for determining peak wind pressure. So in terms of that characterization of the boundary layer, they did 3D. Are there questions in the meantime that you want me to address or not really? Okay. There are 3D hot spire measurements that we have at 5 spanwise locations and then 52 vertical locations. And those are 20-second time series with a sampling frequency of 2000 hertz. So this really allows us to look at these profiles, not only of the mean velocity as you see here, but also of turbulence intensities in the 3 directions, and look at what the variation is in the spanwise direction, which is a measure of the uncertainty in that boundary layer in the wind tunnel. And then the pressure measurements are shown in a bit more detail here. So they focused on these 2 tiles, A and B. And then you see a zoomed in picture of how high the resolution on these tiles really is. We have 300-second time series here with a sampling frequency of 500 hertz. And then our quantities of interest are going to be the mean pressure coefficient. So we look at pressure coefficient time series. We'll do root mean square fluctuating pressure coefficient, so the CP prime. And we'll look at peak pressure coefficients. And the peak pressure coefficients are obtained by doing extreme value analysis of that time series. Then the design pressure coefficients, I'll explain later how we get those exactly. Okay, so let's look at first the 0-degree wind direction, so the wind perpendicular to the building. And we started here by running these simulations with OpenFOAM because it's a code that is very widely used by the community. So if we could validate that we can do these predictions, that would really have an impact in terms of what the engineering practice could do. Our domain is 20 meters long, 4 meters high, and 5 meters wide, similar as the Politecnico di Milano wind tunnel. We have 7.5 million cells here. We checked grid sensitivity as well. We use a very simple standard Smagorinsky subgrid model. This is some details on the schemes and the time stepping. The simulations took quite long, and we couldn't really speed that up much more because the main challenge here is that we need really long time series to do our extreme value analysis. So we've kind of maxed out on the scaling in terms of parallelizing it. And yeah, we would be using more CPU hours and only reduce the time a little if we went to more processors. Then our boundary conditions are periodic at the site, no slip on top. We have a smooth log-law wall function on the building and a rough wall function on the ground. But the most important one here is that we know the pressure coefficients are sensitive to the turbulence in the incoming flow. So what do we do at the inlet of computational domain? So we use a divergence-free digital filter, but we combine it with a gradient-based optimization to make sure that we really get the quantities we want. So how does that work? So the digital filter is a version that was proposed by Kim in 2013, which specifies a mean velocity profile that is a logarithmic law as a function of height, as we expect to see in a wind field. And then we add a fluctuating field on top of that. That is a function of the Reynolds stress component magnitudes, and then the time scales for the UV and the W components. And then you generate a random field that is filtered to achieve these correlations with the desired length and time scales, and you scale it using these magnitudes of the Reynolds stresses. And in addition to that, we use a rough wall function so that we sustain that log-law without having to resolve the roughness elements that you saw in the wind tunnel, because that would make the simulations a lot more expensive. So this sets up the inflow very nice, but you run into a problem that you have in most of these cases where you use these synthetic turbulence generators, which is that the synthetic turbulence is not a solution of the governing equations. And as we move downstream in the domain, you really see a decay of that turbulence intensity. So now if in the future I'm going to put a building in my simulations, I'm very likely going to see much lower fluctuations in my pressure signal because I have lost that turbulence in my. So we did a relatively simple workaround here, which is that you specify that inflow, and then you look at what the statistics at the building are in a simulation that doesn't really have a building, but the statistics at the future building location. You check how those values compare to what you had in the Winton experiment. If that's good enough, you go ahead and you run a simulation with the building, but it's not, you do a gradient-based optimization adjusting this until you satisfy this criteria. And that works really well. And it also gives us a tool to start looking at sensitivity analysis. So that's what we did as well. So we characterized the inflow uncertainty by having 3 uncertain parameters in the inflow. The first one is the roughness height. So that's going to change our mean velocity profile that you see in the plot on the left here. The second is we have some variability in the overall level of turbulence kinetic energy in the flow. And the third is that we changed the time scales to vary corresponding to the variation that we saw in the wind. And we ran combinations of all of these. So we have 3 values for each parameter, and we ran 27 simulations in total. So I'm first showing you this to give you an overall idea of the flow. This is for a baseline simulation. The colored contours are the streamwise velocity. And then the black and white contour on the building surface is the pressure coefficient. So you see in the incoming flow field, the velocity increasing with height, right? And the turbulent structures in that velocity field. And then around the building, you see these unsteady separation regions, both on top and on the sides of the building. And then the wake in the back, which shows some vortex shedding. And you have the separation region on the building, which has the most negative pressure coefficient values. And that is a highly unsteady phenomenon as well, right? And then the flow does reattach on the building further downstream. So if we just look at the baseline large eddy simulation, so here I'm using the mean values for roughness, turbulence kinetic energy, and time scales. This is the comparison of the mean pressure coefficients in the locations on the building where we have measurements available. So you see that this is a really good comparison. And then when you look at the root mean square fluctuating pressure coefficient, you see that you also have that good comparison between the experiment and the large eddy simulations. Those are for the baseline LES. So if we look at the sensitivity analysis, this shows you profiles along this line of taps that you see here indicated in red. So this is the X location along the building. This is the mean pressure coefficient. And you see that the sensitivity bounds on the mean pressure coefficient are very small, right? So uncertainty in the inflow doesn't affect the mean pressure coefficient much. But if you look at the root mean square values, you see that the sensitivity bounds are much larger, right? And by accounting for that uncertainty, we actually explain the discrepancy between the experiment and the LES, the baseline LES simulations very well. Then if we look at peak pressure coefficients, we see that the LES reaches as negative values as the experiment. This picture shows you the most negative values that we got in the 27 simulations. If we compare the baseline LES to the Milan experiment, you see that we're slightly under predicting these peak pressure coefficients. But again, the sensitivity bounds explain a lot of the discrepancy. The other thing that is really important to note is that we're still doing an LES, right? We're still solving filtered equations. So we shouldn't be expecting to resolve these peaks as negatively as in the Winton experiment. So you could try and start working with subgrid modeling to kind of account for what the difference might be, right? But the question is that important from a design point of view? Because from a design point of view, you don't care about the pressure at one location. You care about the overall load on the cladding panel, right? So that's what is being shown here. So this is a panel at the mid-height of the building. And then the red dot is the pressure tap at which we're plotting this raw data, which is the yellow curve. And these are 2 different time series where we saw a negative peak. And then if you take the area average on the panel, shown in blue here, you would get the blue curve. And so you're actually filtering out these peaks, which is what your large eddy simulation is doing as well. If you have enough pressure taps available on a panel, you can calculate that area average. In most wind tunnel experiments, they wouldn't have that. And what they do is they do a time filtering, where they have a time scale for the filter that is some constant multiplied by a length scale, usually the diagonal of the panel, and then the free stream velocity at building height. And that is actually one of the main challenges in the wind tunnel, to determine what that constant should be. Because you see here that the 4.5 value, which is the magenta signal, corresponds quite well to the area average, but the constant actually depends on where you look on the building facade, what wind direction you're considering, etc. So the CFD you wouldn't have to do any of this, right? Because you can always calculate the area average load as long as you have a reasonable number of grid cells on a panel. And that's the comparison that I'm showing here. So we look at the 0-degree wind direction at the top corner here, and we look at different panel sizes. So we go from very small panels to much larger panels. And that's what you see on the x-axis here. So small panels to larger panels. And then the area average peak pressure coefficient on that panel is shown here. So we did an extreme value analysis on that area average signal. And you see that now the sensitivity bounds really fully encompass the data that we have from the experiment. So the LES can predict these peak design loads on panels really well, quantitative. So that kind of concludes the analysis for the 0-degree wind direction, where we've shown that LES can reproduce these pressure coefficient statistics. And we can directly calculate peak pressure loads over areas of interest. We've also shown that the root mean square and the peak values are highly sensitive to the turbulence in the atmospheric boundary layer flow at the building location. So you can't just look at the inflow, you really need to think about what happens at the building location. So that means that a very careful calibration of these inflow conditions is needed. So what are the takeaways here? Experimental data sets should really report detailed boundary layer turbulence characteristics, including uncertainty intervals, because if you don't have those, it's going to be really tricky to do validation. The LES should then account for that uncertainty when it's comparing results. And it also tells us that we need to do more full-scale measurements in real atmospheric boundary layer flow and in real extreme wind events, because the relationships that are being used right now to determine turbulence intensities and turbulence length scales, they start from the idea that you have a synoptic high wind speed. It doesn't think about what happens in a downburst or what happens in a hurricane, etc. And those turbulence characteristics might be quite different. And that would really affect what peak pressure loads you're going to see. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to the other wind directions, because we know that the 0-degree case, although it's the most studied one, is actually not the most critical one. When you start to look at small oblique angles, and I'll focus on the 20-degree angle mostly here, you can actually see that you get extreme events near the upper corner, near the trailing edge of the building on the downstream side of it. So the CP magnitudes, and I've shown that here for this pressure tap for 20 degrees. The blue is the experiment. They can reach magnitudes that are in excess of -7. And the mechanism that generates these peak events is not well understood. So we had two goals here. One is, can we validate the large eddy simulations for these flow directions that give these negative peaks? And two, can we say something more about the flow physics that are happening in this case? And you already see in this plot on the left, right, that yes, we can predict these very negative pressure coefficients. And that is shown in a bit more detail here. I should also say we ran these simulations with Charles, not with OpenFOAM, which allowed us to get a much better resolution at a lower computational cost. We have in this plot 10, 20, and 30 degree wind direction, the experiment on the left and the LES in the middle. And you see that for all of these wind directions, we do really reach these negative pressure coefficients. And if we contrast that with the results that we had in the wall of wind when we set up the repeat experiment, you could actually if I didn't tell you which is which, you wouldn't really be able to tell me, right? Which was the LES or which was the wind tunnel trying to reproduce the original result in MEAM. So the validation is done with this, right? So now the idea is, can we understand better what is really happening? And the way that we looked at the flow is by plotting these isosurfaces of Q criteria. And then we colored the eddies by the sign of the X component of the vorticity, which basically tells you the rotation of the eddies. So you could expect that if you have two eddies that are rotating in the same way and they merge, you're going to get stronger, right? So you're going to get these more negative pressures. So that's what you'll see in this movie. So this is the wind direction is from here, and you get this like big vortex overall along the edge here. But you also get a lot of shedding further downstream, and these structures that kind of move over the roof and then move over the edge and join the structures that are on this side. This is a back view, so this corner here is the same as this corner here. And then we have time series at 3 pressure taps near this back corner here, and they're shown here. Tap number 1, number 2, and number 3 are there. Yeah? So this is the contour of the instantaneous pressure coefficient. So I'll play this once, and then I'll go back and stop it in a few of the critical locations. So you see that this structure causes this very negative pressure, right? And if you look, you see some of these very negative. See, now you get a very negative, very local peak. You're going to see one coming up here as well now, a very negative peak. And then the most negative one is actually seen right at the corner of the building. So if I go back to what you see there, this is always a little challenging. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to walk you back. Okay, so you see this very negative pressure in the pressure contour at number 1, right? And if I go back in time a little bit, you actually can see what is happening. Oh, this is tricky. I need to look at my screen. Okay, yeah, you can see what is happening here. So that location of that pressure tap is right here. And you see this little eddy that is moving across the edge of the roof and joining that low pressure region already. And that gives that very negative pressure peak locally. You can see something very similar at that second pressure tap when that happens, but it's harder because that is really a very small structure that is doing this. So it's this little one here. That's exactly the location of that pressure tap. And then what happens at the very end is also interesting. You have this one that is shed from the edge of the roof and that actually wraps around and attaches to the corner and gives that very negative pressure. So the simulations can not only predict these, right, but they can help us to look in more detail at what is happening. And we're still working on processing this data and getting some more insight from it. So the conclusion for these other wind directions is that we can reproduce the CP statistics with good accuracy at all the wind directions. And that includes highly localized extreme suction events, given that we have a sufficiently fine grid resolution. So that is, of course, very important. And then finally, the LES simulations allow to do an analysis of simultaneous velocity and pressure measurements, which is really difficult to do in a wind tunnel, right? So that can really help us to improve our understanding of these peak pressure. Okay, so I do think I have time, right, to go into the last section here. Okay, good. So I'll talk a little bit about multi-fidelity modeling because we've seen that LES can do this, but it is, of course, quite expensive, right? The Charles simulations took us about 4 weeks. If we're not trying to really resolve these very localized events, we could probably reduce it to 2 weeks, maybe get it under a week. But we would still have to do the analysis for all of the wind directions. And generally, this is done with a 10-degree resolution. In addition, we've shown that the results are very sensitive to these boundary layer characteristics. So you would like to do some sort of uncertainty quantification there as well. So we're talking about running 36 simulations and then maybe like 3 times 36 to look at uncertainty, right? So that cost becomes very substantial. So the idea there is if we can leverage the low computational cost of the run simulations, which we know can't accurately predict the turbulence quantities, but there might be some information there, right? Together with the high accuracy of the LES. And the starting point that we did here is we said, okay, we'll do runs at the 10-degree resolution or even more, right? Because these simulations take a few hours. And then we'll do LES at a smaller subset of wind directions, and we'll try to combine that information to get accurate predictions at all of the wind directions. And we're trying lots of different approaches. The one that is written up right now is the one using machine learning. And there we said we're going to use high fidelity LES data for the CP prime and relate that to low fidelity features that we get from the run simulations. And these simulations are a mean pressure coefficient, a non-dimensional thermokinetic energy, the inlet velocity in the simulation, the norm of the pressure gradient, and the friction coefficient. And then, so we did a model search on a validation set for 45-degree wind direction to come up with the overall setup of the neural network. And then we did a data split for training and test data by using half of the wind directions for training and the other half for testing. We have 42,000 data points per wind direction. And we also use bootstrapping so that we sample the replacement training data with replacement and we can have some confidence intervals on these predictions. And the first thing we did is we said, okay, we throw all the training data in and we try to come up with one model that will predict for all the test data, all the wind directions. And it works, but it wasn't like that good. So we took a step back and we said, okay, can we think more carefully about which training data is best to predict certain wind directions? So we did a principal component analysis of these features, and we see that 99% of the variance in the RMSCP is explained by the first 2 principal components in the feature space. And that's what you see here. So X1 and X2 are these principal components, and you see them both for the test and the training data. So then we looked at which ones are most similar, and we used this Kullback-Leibler divergence to identify the 2 most similar wind directions. So for example, for the 0-degree case, you would see that the 10 and the 90 actually have the most information. Yes. So I'll show you a few predictions. The first one is for the 40-degree wind direction, where it actually works pretty well. So you have the LES pressure contours on the entire building at a 40-degree wind direction. Here you have the run simulation, so you see how bad the runs actually is, right, at doing these predictions. And then here you have the multi-fidelity model, and you see that you recover the values that you have in the LES, and the root mean square error is significantly reduced. If you look at some profiles of these pressure coefficients, so red is LES, blue is runs, and then the gray with the confidence interval is the machine learning model. You see that we're doing much better, and the confidence intervals contain 84% of the LES data overall. If we look at the 0-degree wind direction, however, it doesn't work as well. You see that the LES gets much more negative values in these separation regions on the site surfaces and on the building roof than what we see in the machine learning model. So we went back, and these are the profiles that just confirm this, right? So here only 51% of the LES data is in the confidence interval. So we went back to look at what happens at the features, and you actually see that this part of the feature space corresponds spatially to these locations of the building where we're not doing well in our predictions. And that is also the part that is absent in our other data sets, right? So it's the same problem as with all machine learning. Once you start extrapolating, you can no longer have confidence in these results producing that. So really thinking more about how do we select training data and test data, I think is going to be key in really improving the accuracy of these multifidelity methods. And we're exploring other ways. We've done multifidelity polynomial chaos expansions, multifidelity kriging methods, etc. as well. So in conclusion, these multifidelity methods do show potential to decrease the overall turnaround time for engineering analysis. Machine learning can help with estimating complex error patterns. We've seen that that can be more tricky with the polynomial chaos methods, for example. And then principal components analysis can inform selecting proper training sets and improve the accuracy of the machine learning model. And it can also help you in advance, right, to identify where the model might not work, because you're able to see from the runs features which areas might not be covered. So summary and outlook. I think we've shown that LES can predict peak planning loads, right? But that the correct reproduction of turbulent wind characteristics is essential. And then multifidelity simulations do offer opportunities for reducing computational costs. So we'll be doing more research on that. And then overall, yeah, we're really hoping to go to this full framework for the wind loading problem as well, right? So we've been working on a couple of components here. First and foremost, we've been working on developing a sensor that can actually measure full-scale pressures on high-rise buildings. And we're going to be deploying it on the Space Needle in Seattle and on a high-rise building in San Francisco. And then we'll have simultaneous boundary layer measurements in upstream locations as well. And I think, yeah, getting more velocity measurements in extreme conditions is also very important. We'll be working more on multi-fidelity simulation approaches. And then a little less exciting, but very much needed, is to establish guidelines and benchmark for building codes and standards. Today, the building code explicitly says you cannot use CFD for calculating wind loads. And I think we've shown that that should not be in there anymore, but we do have to provide guidelines for practitioners to do it correctly. So that's all I had, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
All right, so if you have any questions, please ask. And also the remote attendees, please note that you can ask questions on chat and the speaker will check the questions there as well. Professor Aratia?
Is there an opportunity to use the experimental data from the pressure sensors as inputs into your LES or even the more reduced models that you have, and check to see how good they will do in terms of the features, right, that you obtain, particularly the turbulent features that you obtain from LES?
So your question is if we could use the pressure signal for the experiment to understand if the features in the LES are well predicted. And when you say features, you mean like the eddies and things that we're looking. I feel like we've thought about this in terms of, can we use the pressure signal to understand better what the inflow should be? Right, what the turbulence characteristics in the inflow should be to match that. I think going from the pressure only to really get to the velocity field might be, I have to think about that more, but I think it will be very tricky. And I also feel like at this point in the validation, if these pressure signals really agree that well, maybe it's okay to just trust that the velocity field is also well predicted, but maybe, maybe. Yeah.
And they become your input data.
Yeah.
Right. And if you have your model validated, then you can actually use that.
Yeah.
Those sensors.
So what I really want to do there is use those sensors to understand what the turbulence in the incoming flow field is,
right.
Which is really, which is really important. So that's kind of, and we've done that for something like just looking at the mean wind field with run simulations, and it works really well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's more complicated in LES though, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess that the data you showed for the large eddy simulation with the side loading with 20 degrees incoming. So the occurring of this large negative peak downstream, as you indicated in your slides, 1 to 3, are those time periodic, or you just I mean initially when you start the flow and occurring only once?
No, they occur periodically, and you can actually see that in the pressure time series. The challenge with these is really to save enough data surrounding the peak to do the analysis well. But I'll go back to this one. Yeah. Okay, so you see the -3 happens quite frequently. The more negative ones happen less frequently. They follow a log normal distribution when you plot the pressure coefficient distribution. So, but the -3 happens relatively frequently. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk. In the experiment, did you observe vibrations in the building?
I don't know if you see this in one of the pictures. They do everything they can in the experiments to avoid vibrations. The model is reinforced on the inside, and it has a huge structure attached to it on one side as well to keep it from vibrating. We've done tests with and without that at low speeds to see that, to make sure it doesn't have any impact on the actual pressures measured on the pressure. It's a key challenge. We're planning to do wind tunnel measurements on the Space Needle too, and I think designing that model to not vibrate in the wind tunnel. Yes.
In a city, how good approximation is to neglect vibration of
It really depends on the structure that you're looking at. I think, and when we do the measurements in the Space Needle, we will put an accelerometer in as well to understand what the vibration is. I think the high rise that we'll look at in San Francisco is not that high that we'll see significant fluctuations. So it really depends on the structure that you're looking at. And I'm very interested in fluid structure interaction, but it's it's a whole other level, right? So maybe in 5 or 10 years. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was just wondering, what is the Reynolds number you're operating at?
So full-scale Reynolds numbers are on the order of 10 million, right? In the wind tunnel, that gets reduced significantly. I think we're in the wall of wind can go to very high wind speeds. So I don't know on the top of my head, but your order of magnitude smaller. It's another question that we're trying to address by doing these full-scale measurements, because so the argument for being Reynolds number independent is that we have sharp corners, right? And separation occurs at the sharp corners, the flow will reattach, and that should be okay. But it has been observed that wind tunnel measurements tend to underpredict these peak suction loads in the separation region. And that might have to do with the fact that, yeah, the very small scales at which you have the dissipation are different, right? If you increase that Reynolds number. So there are some open questions there. Yeah, and we're hoping with the full scale measurements to address that. And we're also hoping to bring the LES to full scale, but we'll have to, the simulations will become more expensive.
And then, so when you do end up at full scale, do you anticipate having to include Coriolis forces and like Earth rotation?
They don't play a role in most of the surface layer simulations that we do. Now, if we're going to go to very high-rise buildings, you can get veering of the wind, and there's so much to do. Yeah, it's a very good question.
Waiting for time. I think it has to do with some kind of POD analysis.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if the question is so the question is there a role for proper general decomposition in reducing the computational burden?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have it on my screen.
Oh yeah, the speaker can see the question on her own. computer. So
Yeah, I can put it up for every, no, can I? No, I can't do that.
So the question, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so because you said the computational cost of running the full simulation takes 3 to 4 weeks, I've been doing some thinking along these lines, and I've been thinking, hey, people do like PGDs where you do these decomposition into subspaces of the full system. And the question is, like, if you do like a parallel PGD computational scheme for this simulation, is there any way it could speed up the computational costs? That's currently a challenge in these simulations.
So I'm not sure if I fully understand what you're referring to. Are you talking about something similar to the work that Professor Farhat at Stanford has done for like airplane design and things like that, where you try to come up with based on the LES with a reduced order model that you can then easily evaluate?
Right. So
slightly different conditions.
Yes.
Okay.
So you generate a reduced order model, and like there are informed ways of
Yeah.
approximation error between your full model and your ROM. But if you have a ROM, you lose some sort of precision, but you can speed up computation.
Yeah, I've been interested in exploring a lot of these ideas. The question is, it's mainly a matter of bandwidth. So if anyone wants to do it, I think it would be a great thing to explore. I think one of the challenges, though, is similar to what we see in the multi-fidelity modeling, is that the flow changes quite a bit when you change these wind directions. And I'm not confident enough that we could do it to really embark on like a multi-year attempt for doing this. But I do think it could be worth trying it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of typical in like structural analysis and things like that for people to leverage Galerkin decomposition and things like that in order to speed up computation. But yeah, I thought it would be worth saying what you think about it.
Yeah, I think that the real challenge in this flow is that we're not trying to predict an overall lift or drag. We're trying to predict these very localized, like peaks, suction peaks, and they change a lot when you go to these different wind directions. And I think that causes a lot of our challenges with multi-fidelity modeling, and that would probably be the main challenge when using any of these reduced order techniques. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll put off that to the meeting with you after this talk. So thank you very much, Professor Catherine Gall. And we'd like to hand you over this small gift for coming to Penn to give you this talk.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, the seminar is over. Thank you all for attending this talk.